In video 9 I looked at setting up and using the FMC to plan a flight and control a flight. But on the final approaches to the runway at Leeds Bradford, things went a little bit wrong and I had to take over and make a manual landing by using manual inputs to the autopilot. In this video I have programmed the FMC with a flight from Cardiff to Glasgow Airport, and again the aircraft is under the FMC control, and we're going to join the video part way through the flight and look at the more correct way of using the FMC information to capture and follow the ILS and glide slope for our final approach into Glasgow. This time I'm concentrating more. Now I am presently on a flight from Cardiff to Glasgow. I am heading for a waypoint called VYL at the present time, and then I'm going to cross over to the Isle of Man, ILM, and will reach my top descent, and then I will come to a waypoint called TRN. My final destination airport is Glasgow runway ILS 05. If I scroll through my flight plan, you can see that after the top of descent point I reach TRN, then a deceleration point, and then some additional points that the FMC has put in. UU103, IUU 73, UU13 and so on, and then I get to my runway. Now before I reach the top of descent point, I am going to put in my lower altitudes. I need to be here at 2,400 feet, and just before the runway I need to be at 1,030 feet. So I'm going to dial in 2,000 feet, somewhere between these last 2 points, so that the FMC has an altitude to aim for once I reach my top descent. As the aircraft makes the final descent, the FMC should calculate its relative speeds and rate of descent to reach this final altitude, at which point I should be at the correct speed and altitude for my final landing. If I look at my map display, I'm presently here and I'm heading towards VYL. VYL is just over 56 miles from me at this point. I am at 16,000 feet and the FMC is flying the aircraft at 270 knots. The autopilot has been set for 16,000 feet. And the heading is under the FMC control, as we can see by the yellow dot. That was achieved by left clicking this to push the button in, and the speed is also under the control of the FMC by left clicking this button. And autopilot 1 is on. So at this time my speed, heading, altitude are all being controlled by the FMC. I'm nearing the Clean Peninsula here on the left. Snowdonia is to the right of the aircraft. Anglesey is just ahead of the aircraft, but I will shortly head out into the Irish Sea towards the Isle of Man. It's just on the horizon in the left-hand corner of the view at the moment. I'm now approaching the Isle of Anglesey and not far from my waypoint VYL, which is RAF Baden, and the VOR is Baden VOR. Snowdonia is to the right hand side of the aircraft. And then ice slates. This This is RAF Valley, and I am 14 miles from the DYL VOR. RAF Valley, the VOR is just north of the RAF station itself. 13 miles to go. The aircraft will then make a gentle turn towards the left, following this green line towards the Isle of Man. Passing over RAF Valley. I am now 5 miles from my VYL waypoint, and I can see the Isle of Man almost straight ahead of me. In the next couple of miles I will reach VYL, and the autopilot and FMC will then turn the aircraft slightly left to the Isle of Man VOR section. .5 miles. .5 miles. 270 knots. Still at 16,000 feet. The aircraft is now beginning to turn slightly left, and it is now heading for the Isle of Man VOR, which is 48 miles away. 47.3, 47. Isle of Man VOR confirmed. Heading 355 degrees. I am now approximately 17 miles from the Isle of Man, and I am crossing the south-east corner of the island. And the Isle of Man VOR is now 16.5 miles from my present position. When I reach the waypoint, ION, the aircraft will turn slightly to the right and head towards Glasgow. I'm now 13.4 miles from ION. Here's ION, here's my present position, and I'm going to turn slightly to the right, all on automatic control for FMC and autopilot. This is Ronalds Way Airport, the main airport for the Isle of Man. The aircraft will shortly make a gentle right-hand turn. I have 1.5 miles to go before the aircraft turns at my waypoint of ION. Now turning to my next waypoint of TRN. The aircraft is now turning, picking up my next leg. TRN, 73 miles away. Now I have altered the scale of my map. I am now looking at 80-mile range, and I can see that I have 70 miles to go between my present position and TRN. However, just before TRN, I have this top of descent marker. FMC has calculated that at this point I need to begin to descend towards Glasgow. As I near this point, I am going to dial into the autopilot 2,000 feet, and when I have made that active, the autopilot and FMC should calculate my descent speed and rate of descent to that altitude. As I get closer to the top of descent point, I will come back to the video. So I am now heading from the Isle of Man towards the Scottish coastline. I'm now approaching the Scottish coastline, so let's take a further look at the instrumentation and how we get this aircraft successfully to the airport. Back inside, this is my present position. This is my top of descent. This is TRM, Turnberry. Turnberry at the moment is 39 miles from my present position. Now at this point I need to descend, but I need to tell the aircraft and the FMC the altitude to which I want to descend. I am going to now dial in 2,000 feet, which will be a nice height for my final approach and intercept of the INS. Now all I have done is to dial that altitude in. I have not told the FMC at this point to follow it. As I get very close to this intercept point of my top of descent, at that point I will left click this to make that altitude then the new active altitude. The FMC and autopilot should then calculate the rate of descent and reduce the speed for my intercept point to the ILS ahead of me. Okay, I am now approximately 5 miles from my top of descent point. I am travelling at 270 knots and I'm still at 16,000 feet. Speed and altitude are still under control of the FMC, but I am now going to make my descent altitude active. I have already dialed in 2,000 feet, and now I'm going to left click. That has made the altitude operational by the FMC, this yellow dot. You will have heard the engines already throttle back. I am now at the top of descent point, and I will start to descend and reduce speed. Aircraft is now reducing speed and descending. If I look in more detail at my main instruments, I am descending at this point through 14,400 feet. It is aiming for an initial altitude of 2,400 feet. That is just above the figure that I have set, because that is an altitude that the FMC has calculated that it should be at a certain point. The throttle has been put automatically to idle and we are descending. The speed at the moment is remaining because we are in a descent, but there is a little yellow arrow here showing that the speed is set to reduce. I am now 4 miles from TRN. I am still descending, passing through 11,800 feet, and the FMC is still in full control of the aircraft and its systems. Looking ahead of me, I can see that the FMC has calculated these various waypoints which will take me to my required runway. In a gentle descent towards Glasgow. am now descending through 8,700 feet. My speed is reducing. I am now at about 235 knots. Now it is important to realise that I need to be in control of flap settings. The autopilot and FMC will not extend flaps. The indication here also is flashing for ILS. Because I am now close to my required airport, I should switch to ILS. In order to switch to ILS for the approach, I switch LS to on and I rotate my map view to LS. My display now confirms that I have the ILS bars in view and I need to watch those as they become active. The radio has been automatically tuned to 110.10 and a course of 051 for my landing runway. That is because I selected to land on runway 05 when I set the flight up. I now have a glide slope indicator operational and my ILS bars, and I have 5,000 feet altitude passing through to 49. Speed is reducing to 220. I now have an arrow visible here with a blue dot, which will be my flaps 1 setting. When I reach this speed, I set flaps 1. And I am watching my ILS bars and glide slope. I'm going to select localizer on. Flaps 1. Speed reducing 180. $4,600. Flaps 2. .140 knots. Centered on the glide slope. Click approach. The aircraft should now follow both the ILS bars and the glide slope. Descending very slowly to intercept the ILS. The airport is just in front and to the right of the airport. The aircraft has now intercepted the ILS and the glide slope. And I have just over 1,000 feet as a slightly lower altitude, that is the minimum altitude. Now, I need to be ready to take over for the final stages of the landing as I did in the previous videos. ILS bar is centralizing, glide slope bar is central. The system now will follow both these instruments and keep me on center. I am now traveling at 130 knots. The airport is directly ahead of me. I know that these have now been intercepted successfully, so I am going to put gear down. Gear down. My destination, airport and runway is now ahead of me. Now, as always, the final stages of the flight, things happen very quickly. ILS bars central, glide slope central, speed being held at 135, calculated speed for a safe touchdown. Flaps full, because I selected flaps full as a landing setting on the original setup of the flight. When I approach the runway, the final stages, I will have to follow the instructions given from the autopilot. Reduce throttle, reverse thrust, spoilers and brakes as necessary. Now, I could set auto brakes, auto spoilers, but just for this demonstration we will keep it a little simpler and we will just land as we did in the previous video. So I will apply the spoilers and brakes and reverse thrust as necessary. Okay, things looking good. Runway directly ahead of the aircraft.
1,000.
Getting rid of neutral for the left. 348, runway 23 right, stage to take off.
Sure, take off 22 right, Citrus, 348.
Runway 350 Boston, Paracost, switch to land, heavy above 340 over the numbers 1250 at 11, runway 22 left for the landing. Runway 27 for runway 4757.
To the land, TLF holding short at 27 right up.
Clear 120 to Paracost, switch to land,
Approaching 05.
right position and hold.
And hold 2 right.
05 is confirmation that I'm heading for runway 05.
500. 500
500 feet.
American 1126 to Tower, wind 240 at 12, runway 27 to the land, traffic pending, from runway will for the
400.
400 feet.
to the land. American 1120. 300.
On center line.
Runway 27, turn on kilo, holding short, runway 23.
200.
Right. Clear 120, runway 23, clear to take off.
100. 70. 60. 50. 40. 30. 20. Retard. Retired.
That's the warning switch because the autopilot has been switched on.
1,200 meters remaining.
And we are safely down at Glasgow, runway 05.
600 meters remaining.
We are safely out of Glasgow. We'll just look at the final stages of that approach again. On replay. You may have noticed that on my final approach there were two aircraft parked on the end of the runway, one of which was on the runway, one waiting. They don't show up in the replay, but I should have actually made a go around because of the presence of those aircraft, but for the benefit of this demonstration flight I chose to ignore it. I do apologise, but that's the beauty of the simulator.
Air 49.